welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help you transform state politics. We know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we will be talking about the dream, right? We know that there is no change without a vision of the world that you want to create. So join us today as we paint a picture of what we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed our state politics. Before we get into that, though, I would love to introduce my fantabulous co-hosts here, Jordan Burke-Powers and Jonathan Cohn. Jordan, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Jordan Burke-Powers. I use he, him, and I have coming on 13 years experience directly in Massachusetts politics.
And Jonathan?
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, and probably in terms of at least with any campaigns in Massachusetts, I'll be hitting 10 later this year for my first time doing something for a campaign in Massachusetts. Wild.
Woohoo! I am Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. And I love state politics, been involved for a little bit too. So we are all very excited to be here with you, transforming state politics together. And today we're painting this picture of what we could have. And the way I think about it is to really, in many ways, compare our country and our life to the way that people actually live in other countries, in many, many other countries. And I'm going to talk about a number of different policies. And it's not just that each of these policies happens in one country, but in most of these, the tons and tons of countries, all of these policies are true. All of these dreams are true. People go to the doctor without ever worrying about the cost. Roads are well paved and they're pothole free. Water that comes out of your tap doesn't have any lead in it. Kids get a great education no matter what school they go to. People graduate from college without massive debt. Friends and family live near each other for their whole lives because they're not priced out of their city. And people have jobs and they also have time for friends and family. And I'm going to go into a little detail about the way that I experience these things, because I am not a particularly underprivileged person. Like, I'm a middle-class white woman, and all of these things have affected me personally. And imagine how much they are affecting the more marginalized and underrepresented, underserved people in the communities we live in. My family, because we're self-employed, we pay probably $20,000 a year in health insurance. And we have an $8,000 family deductible, $3,000 each. So we never hit the deductible and we have to pay for out of pocket for everything. So I would actually prefer to take all of those dollar bills and light them on fire, because I would get more enjoyment out of lighting them on fire than I get out of paying them to insurance companies that are, their job is to make sure we don't get the care that we pay for. Our roads are filled with potholes, like 100 potholes in one single block. And I've injured my wrists before, biking in the rain, not being able to see all the potholes. It damages our cars. It's just unpleasant. And I have a young child. He's now over 6. I don't have to worry about lead anymore. But every time we moved, when he was under 6, we would have to test the water. We would have to test the paint. We would have to test the soil, because you can poison your child forever. And we should have water that we can drink coming out of our tap. I know when I was a kid, my mom did not make a lot of money. She, at one point, when I was for my high school, my sister's junior high and high school, she spent 70% of her income on rent so that we could go to a good school. Because if you don't live in the right neighborhood, your schools are totally underfunded. And then, most of my friends and family live far away. And that's not good for our communities. It's not good for our peace of mind and our mental health. But everybody is priced out. Every 5-10 years, you can no longer afford the rents in the place, or the housing prices in the place where you once lived or where you grew up with your family. And so many people that I know have multiple jobs, or they have a job where they have to work, tons and tons of hours. Whoever has time to have a life? What has happened to that whole concept of having a life, being able to spend time with your friends and your family because you have time and you're paid enough money to have a decent life. So that's my dream. That is my dream. And I know that we could have it here in Massachusetts for 7 million people.
Yeah. You know, I I think all the time about how silly it is that when you're sick, you have to figure out how sick you are and whether or not to go to the doctor. And nowhere else is that true. I've never experienced that in the other places I've lived around the world. And you know, there's all these talks about how there's all these delays and rationing in other places that have things, but like, who here gets appointments right away as soon as you need them? Who in our system has easy access to their healthcare providers? I don't know anyone in this system who has easy access to their healthcare providers. Even if you have you know, I guess if you have unlimited money, you can pay for anything. But you know, most people, even if they have good plans, still have trouble getting to their doctors. And when we say plans, I think it's important for us to remember what we're talking about. They're not making things for us. They're not giving us food. They're not building us cars. They're not paying people to do things for us. Health insurance companies are just an in-between. They're an in-between between the thing we actually need, which is healthcare, and they make money as an in-between. So they literally serve no purpose. They don't make anything. They don't do anything for us. They don't serve any purpose except to push paper. and they extract from our money. They make profits that go to Wall Street. That's an absolutely bonkers system. That makes no sense. What should happen is, if you get sick, you should get the care you need. That's what should happen.
Crazy
just
idea.
like the mail comes, right? It's just you pay somebody a little bit and the mail comes to your house. Just like you pay property taxes and you go to a school and there's teachers there and there's services there. Or if you pay taxes and there's not an in-between that you call to have the fire department maybe come, right?
Thank goodness.
Pushing paper saying like, how on fire is your house right now? Right? That's not happening. So they just come to your house. They should be able to spend the coverage care. It's really good. This makes no sense, this system.
What I would check in with especially wild, because I feel like that the fire argument is one that really kind of aligns well with healthcare. Is one of the reasons why it is very valuable to have a fire department. Is that if there is a fire at your house, that fire can spread to every other house around you, and that is an important thing to stop before it does too much damage to your house as well as others. In the same way in which like sickness is something that by its nature spreads, and it's like a fundamentally warped model that we view it as a very individualized thing as opposed to a social thing that then requires robust social infrastructure to make sure that we're able to kind of to address problems early. And I think just in general speaks to a lot of the weakness of social infrastructure in the US. The one thing I was thinking of that whenever I see this stat, I'm always horrified by how expensive childcare is in Massachusetts. Of the simple fact that there are so many things that in other countries are built in part of understanding whether it's childcare or whether it's like elder care, that spectrum of care, we're knowing that is a strong burden that for families to have to bear the cost of themselves, that not everyone would be able to afford. And that's fun. Like when you're in your old age, you should not have to be worrying about how you can afford to be in a nursing home that you want to be in, or how your children can afford to do that for you, because it should be a part of a general spectrum of kind of making sure that people are taken care of early when they can't quite take care of themselves, then when they're being taken care of late when they can't quite take care of themselves.
Everybody gets old unless you're very unlucky.
Exactly. If you're lucky enough to get very old, you should be taken care of. And the one other thing I wanted to think before is just the ability to get to where you need to go in the state where that we should be designing communities, and people should be able to afford to live in those communities where the things that they need they can get to in trips that are not going to be kind of done under by traffic, that the things that you need to get are near you, and that you can get to them, whether it is by walking or biking or public transit. So you are not auto dependent to be able to get the basic things that you need, or basic trips that you need to make on an everyday basis.
I know, Jordan, you and I both have kids in the school system, and like, you have thoughts about the whole education?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, the help, most people. So I have a friend who's currently, having a kid, and, knock on wood, all things considered, and, they're talking about like how are they going to afford it. People often, in Massachusetts, some people stop working so they can be home because the money they bring home from working is not enough to cover childcare, which is a really bonkers thing to say out loud. For my wife and I, we only could afford 1 day of childcare a week. Somebody had to be home with Ella when she was a baby because we couldn't afford more than a day. It's like really it's a huge deal that our state basically is treating like it's sort of like a thing maybe we can fix at some point in the off future. Like it's an inconvenience, like the way they talk about it and the way we treat it. But we could do that tomorrow. I think that's the important thing to note for all of these things. We could have a system where when you get sick, you go to the doctor tomorrow. We could vote that into existence tomorrow. We could vote into existence having childcare that's affordable for people. We could do that. We don't need to create it. We don't need to be imaginative. We can just look at what other people are doing and do it tomorrow.
And I want to point out that not only, if sorry to interrupt, but not only could we do it tomorrow, I mean, any state could do it tomorrow, but in Massachusetts, those are popular policies. Mm-hmm. Like the people want those policies. So the question is, why are we not passing those policies tomorrow?
Yep.
One thing I was thinking of when thinking of like what the basic infrastructure that a state that values its people would have, as opposed to even just from a basic of valuing people and thinking of having a kind of even like economic efficiency, which isn't like basis of is universal broadband access. Mm-hmm. Is something that like it's something I'm always very shocked about, has been seeing about, let's say, both in rural parts of Massachusetts as well as in some of the low-income urban areas, that about broadband being something that is just not, that people just don't have. And that's something that like that again is that type of like vital infrastructure on which everything else has to be built, and so much in this day and age, where we shouldn't be treating things like that or like good public transit as some type of add-on. It is that foundational aspect on which people's ability to do what they need to do, people's ability to get to a job, to run errands, or to function in society need.
Yeah, and I just want to say, and we should talk about education in a second, but I just want to say just on transportation, like how bonkers our system. We often think of it, and we should think of it in a Massachusetts thing. But I saw a thing the other day that I just want to quote because it's just fantastic about how bonkers our country is about this. In 2019, there were 18,142 flights with over 2 million passengers flew between Atlanta and Orlando, 400 miles apart. They are not far away. It takes a French train about 3 hours to do that flight. And it's almost no carbon would come out. Like just the carbon from those trains would be almost nothing. 18,000 flights. There are so many. Every day, there is a flight that flies out of Worcester and goes to Newark or goes to some other place that there should be a train to.
Yeah.
It would take less time than it would take to drive to the airport, park at the airport, get in a plane, right? Load it up, fly, do a bunch of carbon, and get to JFK to right. And like it's not just that it takes forever to get from Boston to New York on train, or and you can't go from Boston to Springfield. We can't go from Worcester to JFK. We can't go, there's not any infrastructure for these things. And that's what it means to like think about when we're driving. It's not just that people are going to and from Boston, and it makes no sense that it's less expensive and more efficient to drive than to take public transportation. Like that's a horrifying reality that we've allowed to happen because we've privatized our these public institutions and believe that they should make money instead of losing a ton of money, which is what they should do. You can't get from Worcester to any place except for Boston. Like there's no infrastructure beyond that. We're not imagining public transportation that gets people around efficiently around the city, around the state, let alone to and from Boston, right? And so we just, but we can do this. This isn't like there are countries that are tiny compared to Massachusetts in terms of GDP and things that have far less infrastructure than we have that could still get their people to and from places through trains, through buses, through things that are more efficient because they understand that they should lose money. They're not doing things like trying to balance the budget of their public transportation systems, which makes no earthly sense.
Exactly. It's something that like it is a public good. And that's, I think, that the fundamental thing of viewing things as public goods, and your public good is something that you invest in rather than expect to charge people to have and to make the money back from it, because it is something that is as well as even like the public transit, as you alluded to, an essential part of any response to climate change is getting people out of cars and in cleaner forms of transportation, that many other countries are far ahead of us at doing. And even to tag in that in terms of things that needed trips, and it's not just for work, so for errand running, but simply for leisure as well, where the ability, the thing that one stat that I always think of that I know like Bernie Sanders would often bring up, is about how much the US stands out in our lack of having paid vacation time as a country, wherein like in most other kind of, let's say, advanced industrial countries, there's just assume that you have a certain number of weeks each year, that in some countries everybody seems to just take them in August, but they're not necessarily tied that you can take off, and that's something that we don't have here. And it's kind of recognizing that value that exists in leisure, and that especially, and how that even relates to building those systems of like, if you're building the parks and the beaches and the museums and the theaters, you need people to have time to enjoy them. And it is better if people can have time to enjoy. The people who have time to enjoy them are not just those who have the most money.
Yeah. And on that idea of vacation time, there's also maternity leave and paternity leave. Let us not only think of maternity leave, because it really alters your entire culture when fathers are under the gun as well, not under the gun, but like fathers are encouraged and sometimes required to take time off when they have a child.
Yeah. I mean, it was critical for me, and it's something that most fathers don't have the luxury of. We've just recently gotten paid family medical leave, and it was difficult and hard it's still being implemented. But yeah, I mean, we're a state that still doesn't value time off, and there's laws that we could put in place to make sure that we're protecting people for those things.
Yeah. We are going to take a quick break before we come back and talk about education and talk about all of the underlying things that if we could pass this stuff that is popular, if we could just get these policies passed, how else would our society benefit from having these things passed aside from the policies themselves? Don't leave. We'll be right back. Here is a word from our sponsors. Hey, listener, we have some lovely people who have been donating to this podcast for literally years. And we know that some of you out there listening and watching would like to join that group. You might notice that we're adding music again to the beginning and end of the podcast. We're adding little graphics to the beginning and end of the video. We are going to be doing more social media and really getting this into the ears and eyes of more people to get this information out there and to grow the number of people that are working together to transform our beautiful state. So please look for the link below so that you can become one of our sponsors. And as always, thank you so much for listening and watching. Welcome back. This is Incorruptible Mass, and we are about to keep the conversation going about our dream of how we could maybe enter the rest of the world in having policies that were truly people-focused and people-supporting. A little bit about our podcast. We talk about why state politics is so broken, what we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it, and how you can get involved. And we do that because we know that if we as a community don't understand the underlying problems, then we can't fix them. And a lot of people don't really realize that fixing Massachusetts is, in fact, the fastest way for us to get our national policies passed. So listen to this podcast to hear how you can have the most impact on the policies that matter to you. Who should listen to this podcast? So we know there are at least 10,000 progressives who have volunteered in progressive electoral work. If you believe in fighting for social justice, reducing inequality, in healthcare for all, in affordable housing, in reforming our criminal justice system, and if you want to be part of getting these policies passed and more, then this is the podcast for you. So continuing our discussion, Jordan, I was going to ask you if you would mind showing off your beautiful little placard and talking a little bit about education.
So for those of you online, we have a little thing that my wife made from a quote that I said on this podcast a few years ago. I think of schools as a place that should be dream factories. And so, education doesn't need to be a place where kids are bored, where kids dread going to school, where kids aren't being engaged in ways that make sense, on issues that make sense, in dynamic ways. They don't need to be places that are weighed down by corporations' ideas on what kids need to learn. They could be places where we allow teachers, students to be thriving in engaging in their world and thought in ways that make a lot more sense. Places like Finland, right? Places that understand that the purpose of education is not to fill children's brains with things that they can Google, but to give kids the critical skills they need to understand what they find on Google, to better, to give context to what they found on Google, and to replace Google someday with something better, right? And so that's the skills we want to have kids going into education. And we fund education, really, we barely fund it. And again, just to link it to these other things, remember that almost, 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 2, no, I'm sorry, or maybe $1 in $4 that you spend on education is going to health insurance companies. So first off, no other country is doing that. Their teachers have healthcare through the government. So they're not paying, Blue Cross Blue Shield for that service. And then on top of that, schools should be places that should be epicenters of learning for people. And maybe also, a good school isn't a place where kids show up and then it leaves. It's a place where people are paid well, where there's staff there, and that there's more than one staff that people rotate through. And there's lots of learning happening for parents who might need to learn English, parents who need a place to go, maybe food or health, or maybe healthcare checks, right? These schools can be epicenters of life in communities. And in some places they are. In Massachusetts, they're not enough. In Massachusetts, they're old, they're decrepit, they don't have heat, that works reliably, they don't have windows, they don't have air reliably. My daughter's school has no way to cool it in any way. And the education system is burdened by the MCAS. And I just I ran to get this thing. So this is my daughter's kindergarten math book. I want you to think about what a kindergartner should be doing.
It's like
what a kindergartner should be doing is learning soft skills. They should be learning how to interact with other kids. They should be learning to play with others. They should be learning some basic things, right?
They should be learning all the things I learned in kindergarten.
Right. They should not be filling out workbooks to prepare them for the MCAS. They did 2.5 of these. 2.5 of these. And I guarantee you that no professional did this, right? This is a corporation. I'm sure they had some college students, some master's students, maybe. who needed some money, who threw together. There's stuff in here that makes no sense. As somebody who's been a lifelong math person, there's math in here that's clearly made to fill pages. That doesn't even make sense when you're teaching math. Just to sell this, billions and billions of dollars to prepare kids for the MCAS. And 5 years ago, 6 years, well, my daughter's older, but like a decade ago, you would have maybe filled out 1 or 2 pages, right? The problem is that because the MCAS ratchets up the need to compete with other school districts, every year they have to compete. They're getting pressure to complete more of these books. So it's not one of them now. It's not two and a half of those books my daughter went through. She cried when they finished the second one at 5 years old because she was like, I don't like this. This is terrible. I hate these things. What are we doing?
It reminds me as well, is that something that I would often see pointed out, particularly when it comes in often discussions around, let's say, like the very wealthy donors who back charter schools, is where they send their where they tend to send their children tend to be the subset of often like liberally minded elite private schools that have small classrooms, that have a lot of like creativity built into the curriculum, and like well-rounded curriculums where they have a number of different electives to take and other type of things. It's like, that is how people who have the most resources often view what they want for their own children. But shouldn't other children also be getting that, rather than viewing other children, like rather than viewing a kind of heavily, let's say, like punitive and kind of a rigid and punitive system for children who need the most resources, give them that same type of kind of holistic education.
Yeah. So I want to go ahead and move our conversation a little bit to, if we're dreaming of these policies passing, there's something I think about a lot when I think about this. If you travel to Denmark, to Finland, to Italy, to a lot of other countries, I'm just talking about places where friends of mine or I have spent real time, right? Actually lived there and experienced it. The people who live there believe in their government. The people who live there believe in democracy, and democracy is very healthy because their government actually serves them, because their lives are this dream that we've been describing. So I know there are people listening to this who are worried about democracy, and we try to fix democracy by doing all these things that are like purely democracy based, right? We try to register more people to vote. We try to change laws around voting. We try and do things that are purely about democracy, but the underlying reality is that when your government does not serve you, you lose faith in democracy. And you can just see it. You can see the people who live in these other countries. You can go to another country and live there, and they really believe in it. So if we in Massachusetts, we live in a state where the vast majority of people want these policies, right? We don't have to fight against the populace. We don't have to fight against the voters. The voters want these things. We could pass them tomorrow, and we could be reinvigorating democracy across here and also across the United States. And I just want to open up a little bit of a discussion about like what would change if we were able to get things passed here in Massachusetts.
No, I just want to make that. I think that's such a great point about like that role of like small d democratic civic culture and social trust, and how much that's built because if people don't think that a government will do anything for them, then it's like, why even bother to vote in the first place? And changing voting laws can be helpful, but if the person doesn't think that the election matters itself, that's not the obstacle. And that when you actually invest, when you kind of invest in the public, when you kind of value those like strong, robustly funded universal public goods as something both provided and as something a part of a general civic ethos that has positive effects, because people then view that, like, kind of view themselves a part of something.
Yeah, and I just keep thinking like this is the problem with the media's focus as the goal of it of government is for Democrats and Republicans to get along as opposed to actually pass things. That the goal of this is somehow to keep, the goal is to keep the Titanic sort of chugging forward, not like fix it so it doesn't like miss the iceberg or go and sink, right? Like it's really weird what they focus on. And so in that place where the goal is not to pass things, but the goal, or to make people's lives better, but the goal is to have this magic, like everyone get along, you actually, people then think that government isn't working even when people pass things, right? So it's like, and then it just builds into this problem that we then can't get people to engage in this process because they'll say like, oh, well, they just fight or they just lie, which isn't true. They don't, I mean, I wish they fought more, frankly. They barely fight at all. They barely advocate for us or fight for us. And they should fight with each other. They should disagree. I don't understand why we would want people who don't agree with things to agree. It makes no sense at all. We don't. And so it just hurts our whole over thing of democracy. And also because then it makes it harder to then pass things if there's no reward. There's no political reward because the media doesn't cover it as success, right? The media doesn't say like, they did these things, they passed these things, right? Like we need those things. And frankly, we don't do it then. We're actually paying into it on the left. Like we need to be more clear when we get change, even incremental, not to say that it's the goal. Like the goal isn't the incremental change, but the goal is, but we should celebrate incremental change because it helps build towards other change, right? Like it helps build towards the thing. And so it's a mess. Like how we think about our democracy is a mess. And then it filters out to people engaging and it becomes fertile ground for fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts on the dream?
I just want to say that we can do this. Like this isn't stuff that is farcical or fanciful, right? We have the technology to put solar panels on every house tomorrow. Mm-hmm. We could do that. We don't need to be beholden to National Grid and all of these terrible corporations. If we could have a government that cared about us and put solar panels on our house and our electricity ran through that, and then maybe we paid a little bit to these corporations, and it didn't matter if you're a renter or not, just put them up and figure out how to make it work. Like we can do that tomorrow. We can have a transportation system that gets people around efficiently and fast, just like other small European countries. Luxembourg can do it. We're bigger than Luxembourg. Our GDP is much larger than Belgium. Belgium has high-speed rail. Mm-hmm. They can get people around. They have, like, GDP is a fancy word. They have less money than we do, and they get their people around more efficiently. That makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
Same with healthcare for all, like a Medicare for all style system. I know a ton of people don't think that can be done at the state level. They think it can only be passed nationally, but that's totally not true. We could pass it here in Massachusetts. We could have passed it 30 years ago in Massachusetts. We could pass it anytime. The bill is there. It's well written. Everything is thought through. Like there's no reason why we cannot do it in Massachusetts. And by doing it in Massachusetts, that's when we're going to get national change, is by passing it in a state.
No, this kind of some of like the mindset stuff just made me think of like the improv framing of like yes and, which that is the response that politicians should give when you are asking them to do big things, is the kind of the yes and of yes, we can do this, and maybe we could do like what are the other things that we need to do, not rather than viewing it as like a no but response to something that people are asking them to do, because we do have the resources to do it.
And I always think about like I get a lot of the politicians get frustrated with me because I'm impatient and intractable in my beliefs that these are things we can and should do. And I just think all the time about regular people's lives, the people who don't have access to power in the way that we wish that they did. They're disconnected from political sources because they're rightly frustrated with this. It was -18 and people were unhoused. They didn't have, they were trying to figure out where to go. in a system where we were hoping that maybe they could get on the internet and see people posting it for them. You know, in a place where we don't give easy access to Wi-Fi and to treat these things. And so we're, you know, I think about my friends who are struggling to figure out where to put their kid. They're like arguing over childcare, which should be in a moment of the happiest moments of their lives. They're stressed about how are they going to pay for their care for their kid. I see teachers quitting. One of my best friends in high school, all she ever wanted when we were in high school, the thing she would say she wanted to be as a teacher. Only thing she wanted to be as a teacher. And she quit over state testing, over MCAS systems, because she was so miserable with the workbooks and the testing regimes and the ways in which it curbed her natural passion for teaching. And like, so we should be impatient about this. These are things we can fix tomorrow. And we only don't because people are just like, well, it feels hard. And it's just like, well, that's right. But it's not hard. It's actually not that hard. It's not a big ask. Just copy and paste what other people are doing.
Absolutely. So we are dreaming big. And I love the idea of a yes and. That is what this podcast is going to be about. It's about yes and getting our politicians to give us yes and. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Please do donate to the show. And we are also going for that, 1,000 subscribers. Help us get there. You can forward this to your friends and ask them to subscribe. Forward it to your mom and ask her to subscribe. Forward it to your dad and ask him to subscribe. And we're so appreciative of all of you who have been listening for the last, year and a half or more. And we can't wait to have another talk with you. Thanks, everybody.